Welcome, you're listening to World Warlab. At 7:42 a.m. on May 27, 1940, Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a collapsing stone wall near the small French village of Lepanet, watching 5 German soldiers move slowly through the morning fog toward his position. He was 33 years old. It had been 14 years since he'd passed through Sandhurst. He had 0 confirmed combat kills. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in just 36 days, and now their panzer columns were ripping through France at roughly 40 miles per day. The entire British Expeditionary Force was fleeing toward the sea. Churchill's company had lost 11 men in the previous 72 hours. The Germans had superior tanks, superior aircraft, and far better coordination. British troops were dying by the hundreds along every road that led toward Dunkirk. What had begun as an organized withdrawal had turned into a rout. Officers burned classified papers in roadside ditches. Sergeants buried equipment they couldn't carry. Privates threw away their rifles just to run faster toward the coast. But Jack Churchill wasn't running. He was carrying a 6-foot English longbow, drawing 70 pounds, with an effective range of 200 yards in the hands of a skilled archer. And Churchill was skilled. Less than a year earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. He'd finished 26th out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a champion, but accurate enough to split a playing card at 50 yards. Accurate enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the attack. The German patrol closed to 30 yards. Close enough. Churchill could clearly see the sergeant leading them, a veteran, judging by the careful way he moved. Almost certainly a man who had fought his way through Poland. The sergeant scanned the hedgerows, checked windows, searched for the usual threats: rifles, machine guns, grenades. It never occurred to him to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The U-bow creaked under the strain. His fingers settled into the familiar anchor point on the string, the exact position he had used tens of thousands of times in practice. He had made this shot countless times on targets. He had never taken it with a human being on the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant collapsed without a sound, the shaft driven deep into his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would also be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons irrelevant. The British Army had no idea what to do with Jack Churchill. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He had spent nearly a decade learning how to be a conventional infantry officer. Then, in 1936, he quit the army altogether, exhausted by the boredom of peacetime soldiering. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. He appeared in films as both an archer and a bagpipe player, including a minor role in The Thief of Baghdad. He rode motorcycles more than 1,500 miles across Burma and India, once colliding head-on with a water buffalo on a remote rural road. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment, but not as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same weapon he had used in international competition. He brought a Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore like those his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier. And he brought a set of Highland bagpipes he had taught himself to play during his years overseas. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers saw him as a liability. The War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into combat against panzer divisions supported by 88mm guns. Churchill didn't care. He had studied military history obsessively. He understood that modern rifles were more accurate than longbows at long range. He knew a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow might manage 10. But he also understood something the planners in London had forgotten. In close combat, in ambushes, in chaos, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychology mattered as much as firepower. A man charging with a broadsword and a screaming Highland war cry was more terrifying than a soldier firing from cover. And a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even realized he was there possessed an advantage no amount of modern technology could completely erase. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. Most left behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, and what remained of their pride. They returned home defeated, exhausted, and expecting a German invasion at any moment. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered his company's retreat. He had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in museums. And he was only getting started. If you want to see how Churchill's medieval arsenal performed against the Wehrmacht's elite units, hit that like button. It really helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Churchill. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit the War Office was secretly assembling. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would be more brutal than anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would be near-suicidal raids deep into Nazi-occupied territory. Casualty rates were expected to be horrific. Churchill formally requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos approved it. By December 1941, he would be leading men onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn, bagpipes screaming into the Arctic wind, broadsword raised above his head, about to prove that sometimes the oldest methods of war were still the deadliest. The British Commandos were born from desperation. By June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Most of the army's heavy equipment had been lost at Dunkirk. An invasion appeared inevitable. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force that could strike back, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. The idea was simple and brutal. Small teams of elite soldiers would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy installations, kill German troops, gather intelligence, and vanish before reinforcements could respond. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be worse. Volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered instantly. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and threw himself into the training program. The Commandos trained in Scotland, in the rugged mountains around Achnacarry Castle. They marched 30 miles a day carrying full combat loads. They rehearsed amphibious landings in ice-cold water that numbed the body within minutes. They were trained to kill silently with knives, garrotes, and their bare hands. Live ammunition was fired over their heads during exercises to harden their nerves. Any man who failed to keep up was removed from the course and sent back to his original unit in humiliation. Churchill thrived. He was older than most of the volunteers, but he was stronger, tougher, and more relentless. He marched farther, shot more accurately, and fought with more intensity than men 10 years his junior. And he possessed abilities no other commando could match. He could place an arrow into a target at 200 yards. He could play the bagpipes while advancing under fire. He could wield a broadsword with the confidence and precision of a medieval warrior. At first, the other commandos didn't know what to make of him. Some believed he was simply showing off. Others quietly wondered if he was genuinely unhinged. But as training continued, his reasoning became clear. Churchill didn't carry ancient weapons because he believed they were superior to modern firearms. He carried them because war wasn't only about killing. War was about psychology. War was about fear. A German soldier facing a rifle understood the threat. He had trained for it. He knew how to react. But a German soldier confronted by a screaming figure wielding a sword while bagpipes wailed had no framework for that experience. His brain would lock up for a crucial second as it struggled to make sense of the impossible scene. And in combat, a single second of hesitation was fatal. By the autumn of 1941, Churchill had been promoted to second-in-command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had carried out several small raids along the Norwegian coastline, but none of major significance. Then, in November, orders arrived from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3 Commando would spearhead a large-scale assault on the German garrison at Vagsøy, a small island off the Norwegian coast. The mission was codenamed Operation Archery. The objective was strategically vital. Vagsøy controlled access to a network of fjords used by German vessels transporting iron ore from Sweden. The island was defended by roughly 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, and an anti-aircraft battery. In the town of Sorvagsoy, fish oil factories were producing glycerin for German explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy cruisers would shell German positions. Royal Air Force aircraft would provide cover. Then commando units would land on multiple beaches at once, overwhelming the defenders before they could mount an organized response. Churchill studied the intelligence obsessively. The garrison was experienced and well-equipped. They had machine guns, mortars, and prepared defensive positions. The coastal artillery alone could destroy the landing craft before they ever reached shore. The attack had to be fast, brutal, and absolute. Churchill requested permission to lead the first wave onto Moy Island, a fortified outpost guarding the approach to Sorvagsoy. Permission was granted. He then requested permission to carry his broadsword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission was granted again, though more than one senior officer openly questioned his sanity. The night before the raid, Churchill inspected his gear one final time. His broadsword was razor-sharp. His bagpipes were perfectly tuned. He carried grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun as a backup. But his intention was clear. He would lead the charge with steel and music, not bullets. On Christmas Day, 1941, the commandos boarded their transport ships. They sailed north through the Arctic darkness, past the Scottish coast and into the Norwegian Sea. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Ice formed along the railings. Men huddled below deck, cleaning weapons, writing last letters home, and trying not to dwell on what awaited them. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps and drilling signals with his men. He had 105 commandos under his direct command. Their task was to neutralize the German shore battery on Moy Island within 10 minutes of landing. Failure meant catastrophe. German guns would shred the landing craft. Hundreds of British soldiers would die in the freezing water. At 8:45 a.m. on December 27th, the transports reached their launch point 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. Landing craft were lowered into the Black Sea. Commandos climbed down cargo nets weighed down with full combat equipment. Churchill took his place in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, broadsword hanging at his side. In 90 minutes, he would either be dead or become a legend. The landing craft carrying Jack Churchill and his 105 men advanced toward Moy Island behind a curtain of smoke. RAF Hampton bombers had laid smoke screens along the shoreline to blind German gunners. The cruiser HMS Kenya opened fire, her 6-inch guns hammering the shore battery. Explosions tore across the fjord, lighting the Norwegian coast like flashes of lightning. Churchill stood upright in the bow, fully exposed. While his men crouched behind the steel gunnels, their commander remained standing. His bagpipes were inflated and ready. 200 yards. 150. 100. At 8:48 a.m., the ramp of Churchill's landing craft slammed down onto the rocky beach of Moy Island. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound cut through explosions and gunfire like a blade. It was unmistakably Scottish, and it echoed across a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The German gunners heard it and froze. They had trained to fight soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not trained to face a man calmly advancing through shellfire while playing music. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it into the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, shouting for his men to follow. The commandos surged after him, Thompson submachine guns and Lee Enfield rifles blazing. The Germans tried to respond, but confusion reigned. They were disorganized, stunned, still trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. The fight for Moy Island was over in less than 10 minutes. Churchill personally led the assault through bunker after bunker, clearing gun positions methodically. Explosive charges destroyed the 4 coastal artillery guns. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun and captured. The German commander was taken prisoner, along with 15 of his men. Those Germans who attempted to resist were killed. Those who surrendered were restrained and marched down to the beach to await evacuation. Churchill seemed to be everywhere during the assault. He appeared at the front of each attack with his sword in hand, directing his men through shouted orders and sharp gestures. During the fighting, a German soldier tried to disarm a commando named Peter Young. Young killed him with a single shot. Another German, badly wounded and screaming in pain, was given a mercy killing by a British bullet. Close-quarters combat was savage and unforgiving. By 9 a.m., Moy Island was secured. Churchill then received a radio message from the main assault force attacking the town of Sorvagsoy. They were facing heavy resistance. German reinforcements had arrived during the night, and the garrison was significantly larger than intelligence reports had predicted. Street fighting had erupted in the town center, and casualties were rising rapidly. Churchill gathered the men he had left and seized a landing craft to cross the narrow strait to South Vagsoy. He arrived to find complete chaos. German snipers fired from windows and rooftops. Machine gun positions dominated the main streets. British commandos were pinned down behind stone walls and inside damaged buildings, unable to advance. The overall commander of the assault, Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, needed Churchill's men to break the stalemate. Churchill committed his commandos immediately. He personally led a flanking attack down a side street, sword drawn, moving from cover to cover under fire. Pressed from multiple directions, the Germans began to fall back, unable to maintain their defensive positions. The battle for South Vagsoy continued into the mid-afternoon. Commandos cleared the town methodically, building by building, room by room. The fish oil factories were demolished with explosive charges. German documents and codebooks were seized. More than 100 prisoners were taken. The victory came at a steep cost. 17 British commandos were killed, and 53 were wounded. Churchill emerged from the battle without a single injury. His sword was stained with blood. His bagpipes were intact. His reputation was sealed. The raid on Vagsoy became the first major commando success of the war. It proved that small, highly trained units could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. It demonstrated that aggressive tactics and psychological warfare could overcome fortified positions. And it confirmed that Jack Churchill's medieval methods were not madness, they worked. The German High Command reacted with fury. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the strengthening of coastal defenses throughout Norway. 30,000 additional troops were reassigned to garrison duty along the Norwegian coastline. Troops that otherwise could have been fighting in Russia or North Africa. A single raid carried out by roughly 300 commandos had effectively tied down an entire army. Stories of Churchill's exploits spread quickly through the British military. The officer who played bagpipes into battle. The madman with the broadsword. Newspapers wrote about him. Commanders requested him for their operations. The War Office stopped questioning his unconventional equipment. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. His next assignments would take him from the beaches of Sicily to the mountains of Italy, and eventually to one of the most audacious prisoner captures of the entire war. 42 German soldiers were about to discover that surrendering to a man with a sword was far preferable to dying on its edge. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. Within the first 3 days, 160,000 British, American, and Canadian troops landed along the island's southern coast. The objective was to knock Italy out of the war and open a second front against Nazi Germany. No. 2 Commando came ashore at Catania on Sicily's eastern coast under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill. He landed carrying his full arsenal, a Scottish broadsword at his waist, a longbow and arrows slung across his back, and bagpipes tucked beneath his arm. His men no longer questioned his choices. They had seen what he could accomplish at Vagsoy. They trusted him completely. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. German forces had reinforced the Italian garrison with elite paratroopers and panzer divisions. Every village became a stronghold. Every road turned into an ambush. The Allied advance was slow and costly. Churchill led his commandos through the rugged terrain, bypassing heavily defended positions, striking supply lines, and collecting intelligence on German movements. By September, Sicily had fallen, and preparations were underway for the invasion of mainland Italy. The plan called for landings at Salerno, south of Naples. Intelligence suggested the Germans expected an attack farther north near Rome, leaving the Salerno beaches lightly defended. The invasion was expected to be straightforward. The intelligence was wrong. No. 2 Commando landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943, and immediately ran into fierce resistance. The Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced the area with panzer divisions and heavy artillery. Within hours, the beachhead came under intense fire. British and American units were pinned down, unable to advance. The entire operation teetered on the brink of collapse. Churchill's commandos were tasked with holding a vital road and rail junction near the town of Vietri-sul-Mare, overlooking the western half of the Bay of Salerno. If the Germans captured Vietri, they could direct artillery fire onto the Allied beaches and annihilate the landing force. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vietri against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, from trenches, from rubble. They repelled infantry assaults and tank probes. Naval gunfire was called in on advancing German positions. Even as ammunition dwindled and casualties increased, they refused to yield ground. On the night of September 14th, Churchill received new orders. German forces had seized the hills above the town of Molina, commanding a strategic pass that led directly down to the Salerno beachhead. An observation post on those heights was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. It had to be destroyed. Churchill studied the terrain carefully. A frontal assault up the hills would be suicidal. German machine guns covered every approach, and mortars were already zeroed in on the obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and annihilated before reaching the objective. He chose a different solution. Churchill would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions under cover of darkness. 2 men could move where 200 could not. 2 men could seize what 200 would never take by force. After midnight, Churchill and the corporal slipped beyond the British lines. They moved through the darkness, using terrain to conceal their approach. They avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. The night was pitch black, and the Germans were not expecting an attack by 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. Just before dawn, they reached the first German position. Churchill noticed the faint glow of cigarette tips glowing in the darkness. German soldiers were manning a mortar position, relaxed and unwary, convinced no one would be foolish enough to approach them at night. Churchill drew his broadsword and moved forward without a sound. He emerged from the shadows like something torn from another century. The Germans froze, then surrendered instantly. They had never encountered an officer armed with a medieval blade, radiating such calm authority. Churchill looped his revolver lanyard around the first prisoner's wrists and used it like a lead, marching him toward the next position. He repeated the process again and again. Each time he approached silently, revealed himself in a sudden moment of shock, and demanded surrender. Each time, the Germans complied. They were too stunned to resist. By dawn, Churchill and the corporal had captured 42 German soldiers along with an entire mortar section. They marched their prisoners back down toward the British lines. Wounded Germans were placed on carts and pushed by their own comrades. Churchill later said the scene looked like something lifted straight from the Napoleonic Wars. For his actions at Molina, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The citation praised his courage, initiative, and leadership. It made no mention of the fact that the entire capture had been carried out with a sword. Some details were simply too strange for official records. The Salerno beachhead was secured by September 20th. The Allies began their long, grinding advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. Churchill and his commandos continued to operate ahead of the main force, raiding German positions, capturing prisoners, and disrupting communications. His reputation spread beyond the British army. German soldiers began trading stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes. They called him a madman, a berserker, a relic from an older age of war. Some refused to believe he existed. Others prayed they would never meet him. By the spring of 1944, the campaign in Italy had bogged down into stalemate. German forces held the high ground along the Gustav Line, and Allied progress slowed to a crawl. New fronts were needed to stretch German resources. Orders arrived transferring No. 2 Commando to Yugoslavia, where they would support partisan fighters battling German occupation forces. The mission promised brutal terrain, constant danger, and an enemy already alert to the legend of the man with the sword. German units in Yugoslavia had heard about Jack Churchill long before he arrived. Intelligence summaries circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters describing a British officer who carried a broadsword and played bagpipes under fire. Some German officers dismissed the reports as Allied propaganda. Others took them seriously. None fully grasped what Churchill was capable of. By early 1944, Yugoslavia had become one of the most savage theaters of the war. German troops controlled cities and major roads, while communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated the mountains and forests. Fighting was merciless. Prisoners were rarely spared. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisal operations. More than 500,000 German troops were tied down in the region, yet the occupation forces continued to lose ground. The British government decided to support Tito's partisans with weapons, supplies, and advisors. The commandos would provide direct combat assistance. Churchill and No. 2 Commando were transferred to the Adriatic island of Vis in April 1944. From there, they would strike German positions along the Dalmatian coast. Churchill embraced the mission with his usual intensity. He studied the terrain, learned partisan methods, and planned raids against German supply routes. The partisans were impressed by his aggression and his willingness to fight alongside them. The Germans were about to learn that the madman with the sword had entered their sector. The early raids were successful. Churchill led attacks on German outposts, destroying equipment and taking prisoners. He moved through the mountains with sword and bagpipes, inspiring the partisans through sheer audacity. The Germans responded by reinforcing garrisons and increasing patrols. They knew something had changed. The attacks were more coordinated, more aggressive, more dangerous. In May 1944, Churchill received orders to seize the German-held island of Brac. The island controlled key shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. Several hundred German soldiers occupied fortified positions overlooking the beaches. Capturing the island would require a major assault. Churchill assembled his force, 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and roughly 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. It was an uneven force. The British commandos were elite professionals. The partisans were courageous but poorly equipped and loosely disciplined. Coordinating them in a complex amphibious attack would be difficult. The landing on Brac was unopposed. The Germans had withdrawn from the beaches and concentrated their defenses in the hills. Churchill landed with his men on the night of May 2, 1944. The partisans were supposed to advance immediately toward the German positions. Instead, they hesitated. Seeing the strength of the fortifications, partisan commanders chose to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Delay meant lost surprise, lost momentum, and time for the Germans to prepare and reinforce. But he could not compel the partisans to move. He waited through the long night, knowing the advantage was slipping away. The assault began at first light. No. 43 Commando attempted a flanking maneuver while Churchill led elements of No. 40 Commando in a direct attack. The partisans remained near the landing area and offered no support. Churchill and his men advanced alone. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire swept the slopes. Mortar rounds detonated among the advancing commandos. Churchill pressed forward regardless, bagpipes wailing, broadsword at his side, urging his men up the hill. The attack faltered. Men fell. Ammunition dwindled. A German mortar team zeroed in on Churchill's position and fired a concentrated barrage into the cluster of commandos around him. The explosions killed or wounded every man in the group, except Churchill. He survived only because he had been standing slightly apart, playing his bagpipes to rally the attack. Churchill was suddenly alone on a hillside deep in enemy territory. His men lay dead or dying around him. German troops were closing in. His ammunition was gone. Escape was impossible. He did what any officer of his character would do. He sat down on a rock, lifted his bagpipes, and began to play "Will Ye No Come Back Again," a Scottish lament, a farewell song, a final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally closed in around him. The Germans approached cautiously, unsure of what they were witnessing. A British officer surrounded by the bodies of his men, calmly playing music while rifles were aimed at him. They did not fire. Perhaps they were too confused, perhaps too curious, or perhaps they felt an unexpected respect for a man who faced death with such composure. A German grenade detonated nearby, and the blast knocked Churchill unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported him to Berlin for interrogation. They were convinced that anyone bearing the name Churchill had to be connected to the British Prime Minister. Under heavy guard, he was flown to the capital, where interrogators hoped to extract valuable intelligence about Allied plans. They were quickly disappointed. Jack Churchill had no relation to Winston Churchill. He possessed no strategic secrets. He was simply an officer who preferred swords and bagpipes. From Berlin, he was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of the city. It was a special compound reserved for high-profile prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, and individuals believed to have value as hostages. Churchill was housed among men who had plotted against Hitler, men who had openly defied the Nazi regime, men who expected execution at any moment. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen marked the end. For Jack Churchill, it was an inconvenience. Within 4 months, he would escape. Within 8 months, he would be fighting again. Sachsenhausen was not designed to contain someone like Jack Churchill. The camp held political prisoners, resistance fighters, and enemies of the Nazi state. Most inmates endured forced labor, starvation, and brutality. Many never survived. The SS guards expected submission, despair, and slow death. Churchill gave them none. He was assigned to a special compound known as Sonderlager A, reserved for prominent detainees who might be used in negotiations. His fellow prisoners included diplomats, politicians, military officers, and suspected relatives of Allied leaders. Among them were 3 Royal Air Force officers involved in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III in March 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by the Gestapo afterward. These 3 survived only because the Germans believed they still had value. Churchill immediately began planning his escape. He studied guard routines, fence lines, watchtower placements, and patrol schedules. He identified weak points in the perimeter and recruited allies from among the prisoners. Within weeks, a plan was in place. The prisoners in Sonderlager A had access to a small garden area near the outer fence. From a drainage ditch in the garden, Churchill and his co-conspirators began digging a tunnel. They worked at night, hiding the excavated soil beneath compost piles. Using spoons, scrap metal, and bare hands, they clawed through the earth. The tunnel stretched roughly 110 meters, passing beneath the fence and emerging in a wooded area beyond the camp. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel and escaped. They emerged into the darkness beyond Sachsenhausen and scattered into the German countryside. Churchill paired up with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the great escape survivors. Their plan was to walk north to the Baltic coast, nearly 200 kilometers away, and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, Churchill and James moved through Nazi Germany on foot. They traveled only at night and hid during daylight hours. They stole vegetables from fields and drank from streams. They avoided roads and villages, knowing that 2 ragged men who didn't speak German would attract attention. The weather grew colder. Their clothing offered little protection. They had no maps, no compass, and no supplies beyond what they could scavenge. They made it within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck failed. Near the town of Rostock, a German patrol stopped them and demanded identification. They had none. Both men were arrested, interrogated, and identified as escaped prisoners from Sachsenhausen. They were returned to captivity, but not to Sachsenhausen. Churchill was transferred to a prisoner camp in Austria, high in the Alps, far from Allied lines. By late 1944, the war was clearly turning against Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Western Allies were pushing through France toward the Rhine. But for a prisoner isolated in the Austrian mountains, liberation seemed impossibly distant. Churchill spent the winter of 1944-45 in captivity, watching Germany unravel. Allied bombers passed overhead daily. News filtered in of Soviet breakthroughs, the fall of German cities, and Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. The guards grew tense and uncertain, aware that accountability was approaching. In late April 1945, Churchill and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were moved from Austria into the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS intended to use them as hostages, bargaining tools in negotiations with the advancing Allies. Under heavy guard, the prisoners were marched through the mountains, uncertain whether they were being relocated or taken to their deaths. The end came unexpectedly. A group of prisoners approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear that the SS intended to murder them. The officers listened. A German army unit commanded by Captain Jack von Alvensleben moved in to protect the prisoners. Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbered the SS guards. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village, free, but stranded behind enemy lines. Most of the liberated men stayed put, waiting for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill did not. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had escaped once, been recaptured, and survived. He had no intention of waiting while the war was still being fought. Churchill began walking south toward Allied lines. He covered roughly 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes and avoiding German stragglers. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, and no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans were baffled by the sight of a ragged British officer emerging from the mountains, claiming to be a commando lieutenant colonel. Churchill had no papers, no insignia, nothing to prove who he was. He convinced them anyway, through sheer force of personality, the authority in his voice, and the stories he told. He told stories of swords and bagpipes, of German prisoners taken at knife point, of battles that sounded more like legends than modern war. The Americans eventually accepted his account and sent him back to Britain through official military channels. Churchill arrived home in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was coming to an end. Germany had surrendered. The concentration camps were being liberated. The fighting on the continent was finished. But the war itself was not over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. British soldiers were still dying in Burma, in Malaya, and across Southeast Asia. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, to play his bagpipes on one more hostile shore, to prove that the old ways of war still mattered in the modern age. The War Office approved his request. By the summer of 1945, Jack Churchill was aboard a ship heading east, toward Burma, toward Japan, toward what he believed would be the final chapter of his war. He had no way of knowing that history was about to change forever. Churchill was somewhere over India when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. It was August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber dropped a weapon that killed roughly 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Churchill received the news with bitter disappointment. He had spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan. He had studied Japanese tactics, fortifications, and fighting doctrine. He had planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with his sword and bagpipes, just as he had done in Norway, Sicily, and Yugoslavia. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no last test. His reaction became legendary among those who served with him. He reportedly complained that without the American atomic bombs, the war might have continued for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something fundamental about his character. Jack Churchill thrived in combat. He found purpose in chaos. He felt most alive when death was closest. Peace was a foreign country to him. After the war, the British military had no idea what to do with Jack Churchill. He was too aggressive for peacetime garrison duty, too eccentric for staff work, and too famous to simply ignore. His record was extraordinary: a Distinguished Service Order with bar, a Military Cross with bar, mentioned in dispatches multiple times. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, and Yugoslavia. He had escaped a concentration camp. He had captured 42 enemy soldiers with a sword. The War Office assigned him to administrative duties in Burma, helping manage the transition from war to peace. Churchill found the work unbearable. He had no patience for paperwork, no interest in bureaucracy, and no talent for the diplomatic compromises peacetime demanded. He repeatedly requested transfers back to active units. He volunteered for dangerous postings. He searched constantly for a return to the kind of soldiering he understood. By 1946, the British Empire itself was beginning to unravel. India demanded independence. Palestine descended into violence. Across Africa and Asia, nationalist movements gained momentum. The world Churchill had fought to preserve was transforming into something he barely recognized. In 1947, Churchill was transferred to Palestine as second-in-command of the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry. The situation was explosive. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust were pouring into the territory, demanding a homeland. Arab Palestinians resisted what they viewed as an invasion. British troops were caught between the two sides, tasked with maintaining order while both attacked them. Violence escalated throughout 1947 and into 1948. Jewish militant groups bombed British installations. Arab fighters ambushed Jewish convoys. Britain announced it would withdraw from Palestine in May 1948, leaving the rival factions to settle the conflict themselves. Everyone understood that full-scale war was inevitable. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem was ambushed. Doctors, nurses, students, and patients were attacked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. British security forces in the area failed to intervene effectively. 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill was not present at the ambush, but he played a crucial role in its aftermath. The surviving Jewish staff at Hadassah Hospital were now trapped on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile territory. They could not leave safely. Supplies could not reach them. They faced starvation or death. Churchill organized the evacuation. He coordinated with British military units, Jewish leaders, and Arab authorities to arrange safe passage. He personally oversaw the operation, moving through contested zones with the same calm authority he had displayed on battlefields across Europe. Under his protection, 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients were evacuated from Mount Scopus. When later asked how he managed such dangerous negotiations, Churchill gave a simple explanation. People were less likely to shoot at someone who was smiling at them. It was the same psychological principle he had relied on throughout his career. Confidence, composure, and the refusal to show fear could achieve what firepower sometimes could not. Churchill left Palestine shortly before the British withdrawal in May 1948. The State of Israel was declared. The Arab-Israeli War erupted. The violence he had witnessed was only the beginning of a conflict that would last for generations. He returned to Britain with his military career winding down. He was 41 years old. He had fought in the greatest war in human history. He had survived wounds, capture, and imprisonment. He had earned decorations most soldiers would never see, and he had no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The British Army offered him training roles, staff appointments, and administrative positions. He accepted them without enthusiasm. In his 40s, he qualified as a parachutist, jumping from aircraft simply to feel the rush of danger again. He trained new generations of soldiers in commando tactics, passing on the lessons he had learned in Scotland and applied across Europe. But peacetime soldiering could never replace the intensity of war. Jack Churchill needed something else: a new challenge, a new edge, some way to feel alive. Again, he found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. The man who had fought with swords and longbows, who had stormed beaches with bagpipes screaming, who had escaped from Nazi concentration camps, was about to discover an entirely new obsession. He was about to become one of the first surfers in British history. On July 21, 1955, a 48-year-old British Army officer stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England. In his hands was a homemade surfboard. He was watching the water carefully, waiting for signs of the tidal bore, a powerful wave that surged upriver from the Bristol Channel twice a day. Local fishermen thought he was mad. They had watched the Severn for generations, but no one had ever tried to ride that wave. Jack Churchill paddled into the muddy water and waited. The bore appeared as a white line in the distance, moving upstream against the current. By ocean standards, it wasn't impressive, perhaps 5 feet at its peak, but it was a wave, and that was enough. Churchill caught it and rode it for more than a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to surf a river wave. It was exactly the kind of unnecessary, slightly dangerous, utterly absurd challenge that had defined his entire life. He was never content to watch something pass by. He had to be part of it. He had to master it, just as he had mastered the longbow, the broadsword, and the bagpipes. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had served for more than 30 years, fought in a world war and multiple smaller conflicts, earned decorations from several nations, and survived experiences that would have killed most men many times over. He was 52 years old and, at last, at peace with civilian life. His retirement was just as eccentric as his military career. He became fascinated with radio-controlled model boats, building detailed warships and sailing them on ponds near his home. He restored old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He continued to play the bagpipes at memorial services and regimental gatherings, remaining a living link to the commando traditions he had helped forge. Even his daily commute became legendary. Each evening, Churchill would ride the train home from London, and as the train passed his neighborhood, he would open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Horrified passengers assumed he had finally lost his mind. In reality, Churchill had carefully calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway. The briefcase landed in his backyard every time, sparing him the inconvenience of carrying it home from the station. When people asked about the war, Churchill was modest. He didn't boast about the men he had killed or the prisoners he had captured. He didn't inflate his role or claim victories that belonged to others. He simply told the truth, and the truth was extraordinary enough. His son Malcolm later recalled that his father would talk openly about the war with anyone who asked, especially over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention for what he had done. The years passed, and Churchill watched the world change. The British Empire dissolved. The Cold War divided Europe. New technologies transformed warfare beyond recognition. Guided missiles replaced artillery. Jet aircraft replaced propeller planes. Nuclear weapons made traditional combat seem almost obsolete. The kind of war Churchill had fought, with swords, bagpipes, and personal courage, faded into history. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He outlived most of his fellow commandos, most of the men imprisoned with him at Sachsenhausen, and most of the soldiers he had led into battle across Europe. He died peacefully in Surrey, England, far removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. His obituary struggled to capture a life like his. One British newspaper wrote that if Jack Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. No fictional hero with such a story would seem believable. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortars exploded around him. A man who escaped a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves, threw briefcases from trains, and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the greatest commander or the most brilliant strategist. He did not change history through grand plans or decisive victories. What he proved was something simpler, and perhaps more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one determined person could achieve what armies could not. His legacy lives on in the commandos he helped shape, in the special operations forces that trace their lineage back to those harsh Scottish training grounds, and in every soldier who has ever been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories of officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories of soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Stories of men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. These were real people. This was real courage. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway? Our community spans the entire world. You're not just watching, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you'd ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence. This is a man who deserved to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.